Hello, this is Danielle DiMartino Booth, and I'm obviously not in a studio. I am at Bobby Van's in downtown New York, and I am sitting with the legend himself, Arthur Cashin, floor director at UBS. You tell me, Arthur, is December 30th 58 years? Is that possible?
It's somewhere in there, yeah. It's 66, 68, somewhere in there.
64, December 30th,
Yeah,
1964.
right.
So, but you weren't always a floor broker. You and I were talking about children who went to military school. You attended Xavier High School.
Yes, here in Manhattan. I went to take, they had competitive admission tests in those days, and I was lucky enough to win a full scholarship. I could have never afforded to go there. And the 2,400 kids took the test, and they gave out 4 scholarships, and I was lucky to get one of them. But I didn't think I could actually afford, forget the uniform. It was a military school. I didn't even think I could afford the car fare to come from New Jersey. But the Monsignor, who was pastor of my local parish, paid for my uniform, and I had originally gone to the nun who was in charge of my grammar school and asked her for papers to go and take the test for the local Jesuit high school, St. Peter's Prep, and she said, no. And I said, no? And she said, no, you won the scholarship and it's God's will that that's where you go. So I had no choice, and we managed to scrape through. And then my dad died when I was a senior in high school, so I had to pass up potential scholarships to college, and came pretty much right to work in Wall Street with no college education. And which I know you have children. As my children were growing up and they started to reach that rambunctious age, they would say, what do you know? You never went to college. So as a defense, I sent away for an application to Mensa, and they took me without even having to take the test. So I've been a lifetime member of Mensa, so whenever the kids look up, they somewhat more quiet. No less surly, but somewhat more quiet.
Well, that will do. My father was indeed a member of Mensa himself. So what was it like to be 18 years old? You started out as a clerk.
Absolutely.
What was it like back then? This is 1964,
Actually,
1959.
I came here in 59 and became a member in 64. So it was a pretty rapid move up.
Was it common to have 23-year-old members of the floor?
No. When I came out, I think the youngest people on the floor were about 45 or 50 years old. There hadn't been a large growth after the Second World War until the Eisenhower years. And as I said, I came into the business in 59, so that was the tag end there. So Wall Street had not really, the market had done well, but Wall Street had not really picked up quite yet. It hadn't become a populist instrument. You know, people owned maybe a few mutual funds, but mostly their relationship to the stock market was through the pension fund of their company. So no, it was very interesting. I got my education in bars like this, which had an encyclopedia behind the bar to settle bets. And one of my instructors, if you would, was a guy I called Professor Jack. He was a trader over the counter in silver stocks, but he had more in his head than 14 university libraries. And the things you can learn from average humans about real life. I'll give you a classic. We were not quite to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we were certainly getting there, and I was still not a member yet, but it was in the early 60s, and word spread that something had happened and the Russians had actually pressed the button and that the missiles were flying. And the option market wasn't on an exchange in those days. It was over the counter, and you had to call around, and I had virtually no money, and I was looking to see if I could make, if you would, a $100 bet by buying a put or some such thing. And everywhere I called, I couldn't get anything done. So I cleaned up and I rushed down to the bar, and Professor Jack was already in the bar. And I came bursting through the doors as only a 19 or 20-year-old would. And I was yelling, Jack, Jack. The rumors were that the missiles were flying, and I tried to. And he said, kid, sit down. Buy me a drink. That was tuition in the school I went to. Class lasted as long as I could afford the drinks or Jack could talk after having the drinks. But he said to me, kid, sit down. And I sat down, and he said, now listen carefully. When you hear the missiles are flying, you buy them, you don't sell them. And I looked at him, and I was 19, 20 years old. I said, you buy them, you don't sell them? He said, of course, because if you're wrong, the trade will never clear. We'll all be dead. And I said, oh my God, that's a lesson you will never learn in Harvard or in the tough school. So in bars like this, I got a world of knowledge, and it has stood me in good stead all these 60 some odd years.
So for years and years and years, my history would come from reading Cashin's comments early in the morning. Where did you find all of those rich and brief stories?
Well, that was the funny thing. When I went to PaineWebber, and they asked me to come and talk at the institutional meeting in the morning before the opening. And because I have a big mouth and never know when to shut up, I would go to the meeting and I would discuss what was going on. And then one day, apparently the phone lines between the branch offices, I think one of the branch offices in Atlanta and somewhere else, and they wound up plugged into the meeting. So they started calling up to the divisional manager and said, who was that guy? And he said, who was what guy? And they ultimately found out it was me talking at the institutional meeting, and they said, our salesmen want to hear that. So I was plugged in then also to each regional branch collectively, and I started to write the Cashin's comments to make sure that my memory didn't become too convenient. Oh, Danielle, I never exactly said that. What I said was, so to discipline myself, I started to write them down, and realizing how difficult it was for many of the advisors, I would start each day with a little vignette on this day in history. And I did it because while I was not in sales, I realized how difficult it would be for everybody to say, we like GE. We still like GE. We're very happy with GE. And if they could say, do you know what happened today 100 years ago? Do you know what happened today 1,400 years ago? And it gave them a chance to talk to the client and break ground for a new day and say, you know, your portfolio could use a little help here. I think we want to be out of the techs or whatever. And it became a big standard, and it was faxed by people to friends and friends and friends, and our mutual friend John Malden once told me that with all the people he talked to across the country, he thought it wound up being refaxed to several 100,000 people every day. And
That's certainly how I discovered you. Somebody sent me, they said, you've got to read this, Danielle. We know you like history, and there's somebody who likes history more than you. So.
well, no, and the repetitive nature of history is helpful. You know, the supposed quote of Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat but it rhymes, it comes very close to repeating. There are fascinating things. As I read, you know, Francis Bacon said, reading maketh a full man, and lacking my education, I think I help myself by being a voracious reader. And you see time and again things through history that are repetitive. I mean, when Alexander Graham Bell and his father-in-law were running out of money trying to protect the patent on their new device, they went to the board of Western Union and said, we'll give you the rights to this product. You can own it. You just have to help pay our legal defenses. It was, I think, less than $100,000. And the board of Western Union said, oh, you don't understand. We're in the telegraph business, not in the telephone business. If they had realized that they were in the communications business, they would have owned the world 10 times over. And it has happened again and again and again. The brilliant boards of major corporations get marvelous opportunities. And I pick it up and I read it and say, you poor fools, don't you realize you're doing what Western Union did? So reading maketh a full man or woman, and I encourage all the viewers to encourage your children to find out history, learn from other people's mistakes will be very helpful to you.
Absolutely. And I think that the history that you've conveyed is richer, if you will, than the vignettes, because you've got some extraordinary stories.
I first came to Wall Street and I was working as a clerk, and my first salary was $39 a week. And
$39 a week.
And at the place where I started, I looked and saw there were guys there who were working at the place for 20 years, and they were making $105 a week. And I said to myself, this is not for me. This is not a growth opportunity. So anyway, I wound up changing jobs and did get an opportunity, but at those low salaries, I thought we could do something. So I put together a singing quartet. Got 3 other guys, and it was the time of things like the Kingston Trio and Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan was just starting out as a beginner. They were folk singers, and being the somewhat garrulous person that I have become, as a teenager, I talked our way into an interview and audition with the chairman of ABC Paramount Records. So we went out and we bought sweaters so we all looked alike, like we were part of a team. And we went up and we sang, I think, 4 songs for the chairman and for the A&R assistant that he had. And he said, you know, you guys actually sound pretty good. And we don't have any folk groups. We just hired a guy from Atlantic Records. If he doesn't work out, I'm going to get a major album thrust for you guys, and we'll take you nationwide. And as you have already heard, the guy from Atlantic Records happened to be named Ray Charles. And that's why I'm still in Wall Street. In the same way the nun said God wanted you to be there, I'm here.
Wall Street has certainly evolved, though. Can you give a little bit of perspective in terms of kind of what the size of the New York Stock Exchange was, how many people were on the floor? When I started, it was at the peak in the mid-1990s. That was when the floor was wall-to-wall people, all 5 rooms, and where we've come to be today.
Yeah, well, it was, when I came, as I said, they hadn't experienced the major blowout. There was the main room, which is the room you often see, and it's the room in which the rostrum is, from which people ring the bell to open and close the market. The Constitution of the Exchange, updated through 1929, had 1,366 members. To be a member of the stock exchange, which meant that you could walk up to the floor and trade. Every stock was traded at one location. If you had an order to buy telephone and I had an order to sell telephone, we couldn't sit here and trade. We'd have to go over to where telephone was traded. And that had a great benefit because it centralized the marketplace. Everybody had to go to that one spot. So even though I wanted to buy telephone, this guy next to us turned out to have a better bid, so you got a better price when you sold it. So when I came down, all of those 1,366 seats were not active. Later on, as you say, they became active, and then you had support staff, you had clerks, you had the pages or runners who I would be executing that order, and once I'm finished with the telephone and I've got to go over and buy General Motors, rather than walk all the way back to where I was, I'd raise my hand and yell squad or boy, and in those days they were mostly boys, and they'd come over and say, take that back to PaineWebber in Booth G. And he would take it back to my clerk, who would report it up, and I would move on to the next case. So by that time, between the members and the clerks and the staff and the squads, probably about 5,000 people on the floor. And we had the main room, the garage. They expanded it into a ramp up to 20 broad, which was called the Blue Room, and not because people were depressed there, although that happened in a bear market, but because the walls were blue and the ceiling was blue. And then business got even bigger, and they knocked down the petition to the room next door, and that was called the Expanded Blue Room, because they got out of creative name. And then ultimately they built a ramp across Exchange Place here, and we went into 30 Broad Street, which is right across the way from where we are right now. So, but I will tell you this, it is unlikely to help the viewers, but each one of those things, when they expanded into the Blue Room, was when we had the dot-com bubble collapse. And when they expanded into the EBR was the next collapse. So if by any chance you hear the exchange is expanding, sell a little bit of what you've got. Right.
Obviously, if there was a busy day for one stock or another, there might be a larger crowd around that company, for example.
Right.
And sometimes you had to read the tea leaves even more differently. So there was a day in 1964 that something was going wrong. Can you walk us through the day that JFK was in Dallas?
Yeah, actually, on that particular day, I was upstairs. I hadn't gone to the floor yet, and it was a quiet day. And the phone to the floor rang, and our floor broker, the guy who preceded me, a wonderful guy named Tommy McKenna called up and said, is there anything on the tape about the president? And in those days, you didn't have the computer news ticker in front of you, or heaven forbid, an iPhone. The news ticker, the Dow Jones news ticker, looked a little bit like a dormitory refrigerator. It was about that big, and the paper would spew out the top, printing on it, and our news ticker was about 10 steps back, but I was pretty sure there was nothing on it because they had alert signals. And if something like earnings was coming out or car loadings, the news ticker might beep once saying, pay attention, we have news if you want to come read it. When 2 would mean maybe it was interesting earnings, and then 3 in a row would mean something important had happened. So there had been no ringing of the bell, and suddenly the market started trading down. Now, I've lived through markets that traded down 1,000 points, but back in those days, a few small points run up. And soon the Dow was down 20 points, and that was pretty significant, and it was headed lower. And the phone rang again, and Tommy said, are you sure there's nothing out about the president? And I said, no, why do you ask? And he said, well, I do $2 brokerage for Merrill Lynch. A $2 broker was like a part-time contractor. If Merrill Lynch got busy and their brokers couldn't handle everything that they had, they would hire Tommy or somebody, and he would execute the orders and charge them a small part of the commission for it. So he said, Merrill is giving me orders everywhere, and they're sell orders. And I said, why are you selling? And the broker said to him, I don't know, but I hear it's something to do with the president. Well, about 15 minutes into it, the news ticker rang 3 bells. I walked over, and there was a headline, and it said, shots reported fired at Kennedy motorcade. President Kennedy had gone to Dallas, and before I could actually get back, and some 10 or 15 steps, 3 bells again, I turned. It said, President reported injured. And I turned, and 3 more bells. Taken to Parkland Hospital. And at that point, they closed the exchange, and it was still time to go. The Dow was down about 35 or 50 points, a large amount for those days. And it always puzzled me. And then several months later, I heard a magnificent story. And, presidents did not travel around much in 1963. So he came to Dallas, and Merrill Lynch happened to have an office in Dallas. Not a lot of brokerage firms did. Dempsey Taylor, a few other people. So what apparently happened was the manager said, look, the president's in town, and I know you guys are interested. I'll keep a skeleton staff here, and you can go all out on the sidewalk and watch the parade with the president in it. And they all went outside, and in a few minutes, looking sullen and disappointed, they came back in, and they started going back to their desk. And he said, what are you doing? And he said, one of them said, the parade got canceled. And he thought for a minute and said, what do you mean the parade got canceled? Now, they were nowhere near the Texas school book, okay, with the grassy knoll, any of that. That was all blocks and blocks up the hill. But these people waiting at the sidewalk for the parade to come down looked up those 8 or 10 blocks, saw the lights go on the police cars, and the parade turned right instead of coming down where it was supposed to go. So they're all sullenly going back. And the manager, who is a perfect example of what I like to think is the right thing to be in Wall Street, it didn't make sense to him. So he called all the salesmen into a huddle and said, give me a bullish reason to pull the President of the United States out of a parade. It's not to sign a tax bill, that can wait. It's not to do this, it can wait. Why do you interrupt a parade and pull the President of the United States out of an important scheduled parade? Well, no, they didn't hear any shots. Nobody thought assassination. But they're thinking missile crisis, nuclear disaster, flood, volcano, something. And he said, 100 bad reasons and no good reasons. And he said, okay, start selling for the discretionary accounts. Start calling all your people up. Tell them we don't know what it is, but we think there's bad news. The President's parade got canceled. And pretty soon, they were selling and jamming up the Merrill Lynch lines. And I am told later that Merrill Lynch called down to the Dallas branch manager and said, what the heck are you doing? What's all the selling about? And he said, give me a good reason to pull the President out of a parade. And they said, you start drinking this early down there? What are you talking about? And he said, no, they canceled the President's parade and we know it can't be good, and that's why we're selling. And that's why 10 to 15 minutes before anything hit the tape, Merrill Lynch was selling, because a very bright manager was clever enough to think of what went on. And that happens time and time again. In Chicago one day, and I can't completely remember the name of the brokerage firm. It happened to be a small regional firm that was in Chicago. And in those days, almost every brokerage firm had a bench in the back where customers would come in and sit down and watch the ticker go by and see what the market was doing. And apparently, it's early in the day, 11:30, and one of the salesmen looks back and he sees the local pharmacist sitting there. And he said to him, Doc, what are you doing? Why aren't you, out with the lunch crowd? And that, he had a lunch counter. And he said, no, I had to close down. What do you mean you had to close down? The Bureau of Health shut me down. Oh, the tuna fish sandwiches? Is that what happened? And he said, no, wise guy, that's not what happened. He said, they're checking on some product. He said, what do you mean they're checking on a product? They had some difficulty with a product, and they're in here checking through all my supplies of that product. He said, what product was it? He said, Tylenol. The guy picked up the phone, give me research. Who makes Tylenol? And he found out it was McNeil Labs, which was a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. And because he was smart, he knew an hour before anything hit on the news ticker. And that's why this is one of the most fascinating businesses in all the world. If you pay attention, that tape tells you what's going on.
Do you still think in this world we're in now that you can still have those moments?
With a computer in your pocket or your pocketbook, it's tough. I mean, when Steve Jobs knew he couldn't say to everybody, you need a computer in your pocket, he had to tell them, I'm going to build you a phone. So now you have in your pocket or your pocketbook the phone that has more computing power than we had when we went to the moon, all in one little package. So you're right, it will be difficult. But sometimes it's not there. If you have a minute, I'll bore you with one more story. I'm standing one day matching, and that next to watching grass grow, that's one of the dullest things you can do. It means that I'm bidding for a stock. I want to buy it on the bid side, and perhaps you or someone else is there bidding for the same stock. And sometimes we take turns, or you might have a silver dollar in your pocket and you would match. And if you didn't match me, then I bought it. Or if I didn't match you, then you bought it for your customer. But it's very dull. And I was standing there watching the tape, and the guy who was standing with me in matching said, are you watching Indiana? And by that he meant Standard Oil of Indiana. And of course, not wanting to embarrass myself, I lied and said, sure. And so we were watching Indiana, and then he looked up and he said, and you're watching Amico too? Of course. And he said, there's something wrong with the oils. They're trading down, and the other international oils are trading up. So I pretended that I had noticed it too, and I said, yeah, I was watching the same thing. So he said, probably trouble in the Middle East. Of course, right. But the international oils were trading up, so that didn't quite fit. And then he said to me, the trouble must be on the border between Egypt and Libya. And it wasn't Amico, it was Occidental. And I thought for a minute, and Occidental, what little oil there was in Libya, Occidental had almost a monopoly on it. And Indiana, Standard Oil of Indiana, there was virtually no Egyptian oil, but what little there was, Indiana had it. So I said, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So then he said to me, are you watching Cone Mills Fabric Company? I said, no, why? He said, the trouble must be on the north end of the border. And I said, north end of the border? And he said, yeah. He said, you know, all those women buying the Italian jeans, he said, well, given the special cotton they have in Egypt, they go there, and Cone Mills just built a mill up near the Mediterranean where they could take it, turn it into denim, and prepare it, and slap an Italian label on it, and charge women $200 for a pair of jeans. So I said, yeah, you're right. Day closed, nothing happened. Indiana had been weak. Occidental Petroleum was weak. Nothing on the news ticker. Stopped for 12. Went home to the house. Kicked the dog, beat the kids. Turned on the TV. And the guy who came on after Cronkite, but before, it might have been Roger Mudd, it might have been one of those guys. But I built myself a Rob Roy and turned on the news, and he said, here's a late bulletin. U.S. forces are being alert because Egyptian forces are being massed on the border with Libya. Sadat had been assassinated, and they assumed that Gaddafi in Libya had sponsored it. And then he blew me away as I was taking my second sip of the drink. He said, the sources don't know if the potential invasion will come by land or by sea, since the forces are massed at the northern end of the border. And I finished my drink, and I said, I got to pay a lot more attention to Cone Mills. So the mysteries are still there. They're a little deeper, but you got to know how to find them.
So I want to ask you about the Federal Reserve, but before I do...
That's your specialty.
It is my specialty. But before I do, I want you to walk me through, I guess in my career, the moment before the maestro came on the scene. which is 1987. So on that day, well, not even on that day, the way you tell the story is it was the next day that was so very critical to what happened in 1987.
Are you talking about the unfortunate day we had in the market?
Yes, that one.
Yeah.
That Black Monday day.
Yes. Yeah, that was special. I remember, and again, the market, very few things happen in a total isolated manner. And the Dow had kind of topped out, as it did in 1929, shortly after Labor Day. And it started to drift lower, and it was getting weaker. And there was real concern about the Fed and where things would, well, it was first concern was about another upbeat in potential inflation. And, were we going to get to see Volcker? And instead, along comes the maestro, as you said. And the Dow sold off 22%, okay, in one day, okay? Prices were falling. It was as if you were in one of those dream sequences in a movie. Things, you looked at the order, and you looked at the tape and the price, and you said to yourself, this can't be happening, okay? And you saw prices absolutely melting.
And this is prior to circuit breakers, presumably.
Oh, yes. And although, as we would later discover, the circuit breakers sometimes can be like lifeboats painted on the side of a ship. They're very reassuring, but not helpful if the ship is sinking, okay?
Well, that takes us all the way to the post-pandemic, so we just skipped a few decades there. But let's go back to 1987.
Yeah, no.
From what I remember, from what I've learned since then, I should say, Alan Greenspan had just landed in Dallas, Texas, where he was just to deliver a prestigious keynote address at an economic symposium on that Monday.
Yes, you in Dallas, Texas, you might remember that well, although you were probably just in swaddling clothes at the time.
I was,
Yes.
still, yes.
But it was dramatic, and everybody had this recollection of Volcker and the Fed and its involvement, not only on inflation, but for people, even adults nowadays, when you tell people that the prime rate was 22% and that mortgages were 16% and 17%, and people happily took them and paid them off. But it was the fact that a very dramatic person like Mr. Volcker told them that the Fed could mean a great deal. And along came Alan Greenspan and began to chat about the market and that things can get to extremes. The Fed has always been remarkable in that it tries to divorce itself from things, and by doing so always seems to get deeply entangled. And so he was just trying to, don't be upset. It could be irrational exuberance. It's just something passing by.
That was many years later on, but Greenspan himself, on October the 20th, was on an airplane. And it looked like things might be worse that morning.
Yes, and
Had it not been for a certain gentleman.
yes, well, what was happening was when the market began to melt down, many of the specialists had trading accounts. People like Bankers Trust and others had gone around and solicited them. The over-the-counter traders, let us have a special loan for your trading account. It all seemed reasonably good. They would either close flat on the day or with small positions. So everybody was very comfortable with it, except for the next day, and when the chairman, Bankers Trust or whatever, I guess was, I'm imagining this, folks. I don't know that it actually happened. But the chairman of Bankers Trust got into his limo and picked up the Wall Street Journal and sees that the Dow had collapsed, and we can't have any exposure to that, can we? And then he learned that they were very aggressive in going out and soliciting the accounts of the specialists or market makers on the floor of the exchange. And of course, as Jim Backus will tell you, when it says B with billions, that's up to the chairman. So instead of letting the guy who knew those accounts handle it, he began to summon these senior partners of the specialist firms over and simply said, your account is closed. Now, these are the major traders on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, which does 75% of the business in these listed companies, the major corporations in America. And they start coming back from these meetings, and I was a governor of the exchange by this time, and they would call me in and say, you may have to stop trading in my stocks. Well, why? I said, well, the bank has shut me down, and my loan line's not there. And I'd say, well, let's review it. And one by one, I would shut down. So pretty soon, 25 or 30% of the stocks on the New York Stock Exchange had halted trading, some of which because of me. So now, John Phelan, who was president, chairman of the exchange at the time, came down and what's going on? And the banks are closing our trading accounts. We don't know that we have capital to make markets. So he immediately went upstairs and tried to call the people involved, Bankers Trust and others, and couldn't get any help. Tried to call Greenspan. He was, as you say, on a plane, headed for Dallas, your favorite spot. And so he was stuck. He called the New York Fed, and Jerry Corrigan was there. And Jerry, while I didn't know him personally, by his reputation, was a bit rough and tumble. And finally he said to Phelan, so what seems to be the matter? And he said, well, the banks are shutting down the market loans for all of the specialists, for the over-the-counter dealers. The market in general faded away yesterday, and we're about to see a repeat unless we do something. And Corrigan said to him, I got the picture, leave it to me. And he called up Bankers Trust and he said, this is the president of the New York Fed. I want you to reopen all the trading accounts for the specialists on the New York. And the chairman said something like, don't be silly, I have an obligation to my stockholders, I have an obligation to my depositors. And Corrigan said to him, did you hear who I said I was? And the guy said, you're from the, he said, I'm the president of the New York Federal Reserve. I could shut your bank in a minute just to have a check. You do what I say, but sir. No but sir. And thanks to Jerry Corrigan, all those stocks reopened. and the '87 crash didn't turn into something permanent. So you had some good people there at the Fed.
Nevertheless, at the time, we've got a crazy crowd, let me tell you. Ladies and gentlemen, for being a Tuesday afternoon before the stock market closes, I just want to share that with you.
And right now,
After Greenspan took over, there's one more story that applies to the world before Greenspan was there, and the birth of the Fed put, so to speak. Greenspan put, Bernanke put, Yellen put, now it's the Powell put. But there's a story that tells us more than anything you've ever told me about what life was like before the Fed put, and that's the Tiffany story. If you could share that.
One of the great things in the business is price discovery. How do you know what the right price is? I've managed for 60 years to become a decent broker because on behalf of my client, I don't walk in with the order on my head and say, what do you think I can get for this? You assess the tape, the industry, you have to know a little bit about these things. But the greatest story I ever heard about price discovery had to do with Tiffany the jeweler and J.P. Morgan, the great banker and master financier. Tiffany discovered that Morgan just loved diamond stick pins. So, as they did in those days in a rather courtly fashion, he sent his man over to see Morgan, and he had a gift box all wrapped up in Tiffany blue powder paper, and he had an envelope, and finally he was allowed in to see Mr. Morgan. He handed him the envelope, which he opened and read. It was from Tiffany, and it said, my dear Mr. Morgan, I know how much you love diamond stick pins. In this accompanying box, you will find one that I think is exceptional and distinctive. It is very rare. I didn't want to disturb you. If you take a look at it, you may send your man to my office tomorrow with a check for $5,000, which is the price because it is so exceptional. If not, tomorrow you may send your man over with the box and the pin's still in it. So, the next day, sure enough, Morgan sends his man over, and he's got the box rewrapped and an envelope now for Tiffany. And in it, Morgan wrote, my dear Mr. Tiffany, as you say, the diamond stick pin is exceptional, truly exquisite. But I think the price of $5,000 is just a bit rich, even for such an exceptional piece. Enclosed, you will find in the box a check for $4,000. I'm sorry. In the envelope, there was a check for $4,000. And it said, if you choose to accept it, you may send the man back with the box with the pin, and I'll take it. If you choose not to accept it, you may give the man the check for $4,000 and send it back, and keep the pin. Tiffany's looking at it. He's a great jeweler, as we would learn later, and he knows he can make money at $4,000. He's making a profit, but I'm good enough that that's not worth it. So he takes the check for $4,000 in the envelope, and he hands it to him, and he said, you may thank Mr. Morgan and tell him I hope to do business with him in the future, but that's not right. My price of $5,000 was secure. he leaves, stares at the box for a while. Finally, Tiffany opens the box, and he reaches in, and he finds not the stick pin, but a check for $5,000 and a note that says, "Just checking the price." And that was what taught me more about price discovery than 3 university libraries.
It's been a very long time since we've had price discovery, and I think that if anything, kind of after the Federal Reserve started venturing into unconventional monetary policy and quantitative easing, and now with the pandemic, you have this kind of marriage of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is now setting prices for corporate bonds, and will the next, frontier be stocks? So, how has the Fed changed the price discovery function, I guess, since Alan Greenspan first came to office?
Well, among other things, as our mutual friend Peter Bukvar recently wrote, they've helped disrupt seasonality. And believe me, that was one of the earliest things I learned. The market has tended to have disruptive cycles in April and May, sometimes into June, maybe May, June, and then again in September and October. And years ago, that was understandable. We were an agrarian society. So in the springtime, when the farmers were planting, they needed to get money to buy seed and fertilizer and whatever. So they would, out in the rural banks where they lived, call down loans, and the banks would then have to draw on money from the city banks. So you would have this disruption of money flows. And conversely, when you had the harvest come in, the factories in the city would have to buy the crop from the farmer, and the monies would reverse, and there would be disruption in the banks. For years, I would always know to look for weakness in September with a possible bottoming in October, and it happened again and again. And as I say, it made sense back when we were an agrarian society, but after 1929, we had more smokestacks than haystacks, and but nevertheless, almost like phantom pain, the market seasonality remained. But as our friend Peter points out, the Fed has stepped in again and again, trying to avert what they view as a disruption, and in doing so, they prevent the market from normalizing, whether it's the seasonality or anything else. I think the Fed has added to inflationary pressure sometimes when they would have dissipated. Mr. Powell believes this is transitory. It may be, but what may be transitory are the gaps in between. By trying to prevent things, they can cause other problems. And that has been a very dangerous thing. Markets and price discovery need to work like human respiration. You've got to inhale and exhale. And you can't say, gee, the exhaling's no good because people cough and whatnot. If you only inhale, it doesn't work. And yet the Fed sometimes thinks that it wants to make sure you're only inhaling. So they don't mean to be disruptive. They aren't purposely doing any such thing. But there is an old proverb that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think we have a well-intentioned Fed that is leaving us open to possible surprises. And there is nothing more powerful on earth, not the Fed, not anything else, nothing more powerful on earth than a free market that changes its mind. And If people, I've seen it time and time again, if people believe something is wrong, markets can crash. And as I said before, painted lifeboats on the side of a ship can look reassuring, but aren't very effective.
I learned that about circuit breakers in February of 2020. Arthur, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful visit. I'm happy to have done it here in Bobby Vans, as loud as it's been. I never thought it'd be this loud in the middle of the day, but here we are. I heard you, you heard me, and I hope that they can hear us as well. And I hope to do this again sometime. Thank you so much.
My great pleasure. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. And I'll remain behind.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Arthur is one of my mentors, and I've learned more about the history of the New York Stock Exchange. Here we are across the street from that here at Bobby Vans, where obviously any day can be a party. And while I would normally say, I'll see you next time, instead today I would like to dedicate this down the middle to the memory of Tobias Lefkovich. He did his first long-form interview on Wall Street after celebrating his 20th year as chief strategist at Citi, and he recently passed away, which is one of the reasons I'm here in New York today, in fact. So if you didn't happen to catch that interview that I did with Tobias, all of his wit and self-deprecation and humor and market knowledge is in there as well, and I think you would appreciate that. So I won't say until the next time, because sometimes there isn't a next time, but I will say be well. Thank you.